Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Daniela Kwiatkowski. I'm the Manager of Training and Development here at MHS, and I'm here with Dr. Sam Goldstein, who will be presenting today on the assessment of functional impairment, a critical target for evaluation and treatment monitoring. We just wanted to say a quick hello. I'm going to turn off the webcam now and for the rest of our presentation, but we just wanted to say hello to everyone out there. Okay, so before we get into our presentation today, just a few logistics that I wanted to run by you. So you are on mute, and that is really to keep the background noise to a minimum. However, we do want your questions. There is a question pane in the webinar panel on the right-hand side where you can enter your questions. We've left some time for questions at the end of our presentation, but please feel free to type them in as they come to you. We'll do our best to answer them all, but if we don't get to your question, we will be sure to email you a response afterwards. We've also added this presentation in the handout section of the webinar panel, also on the right-hand side, as well as some other documents there. Please be sure to download those now, and if you haven't already, and at least download them at some time during the presentation itself. Once we close down the webinar, they won't be available, but we will be sending them out afterwards as well. So don't worry if you don't get a chance to. We're also recording this webinar, and it will be available in our Learn Center for any colleagues who are unable to attend the live version. Okay, so we are giving out continuing education credits for today's webinar. In the next day or so, you will receive an email with a link asking for your feedback on today's program. Once you submit your feedback, you'll be prompted to generate your certificate that will provide you with the CEU information that you need. And remember, you need to attend the entire webinar in order to qualify for those credits. So a little bit about who we are for those of you who are meeting us for the first time. Multi-Health Systems is a global publisher of scientifically validated assessments in the clinical, education, public safety, and talent assessment markets. We are located in Toronto, Canada, and we've been in business for over 30 years. We publish assessments in over 50 languages and have a presence in 75 countries around the world, so we really are truly global. And so now I'd like to introduce you to your presenter today. Sam Goldstein, PhD, is an assistant clinical instructor at the University of Utah School of Medicine and on staff at the University Neuropsychiatric Institute. He's a licensed psychologist and has been nationally certified as a school psychologist. He is clinical director of the Neurology Learning and Behavior Center. Dr. Goldstein has authored over 40 texts as well as over 50 book chapters and 24 peer-reviewed research articles. He currently serves as editor-in-chief of the Journal of Attention Disorders and sits on the editorial boards of 6 peer-reviewed journals. He is co-editor of the Encyclopedia of Child Development. Recent books include the Handbooks of Neurodevelopmental and Genetic Disorders in Children and Adults, Handbook of Resilience in Children, Assessment of Intelligence and Achievement, Assessment of Autism Spectrum Disorders, and Assessment of Impairment. He is co-author of the Autism Spectrum Rating Scales, Comprehensive Executive Functioning Inventory, Rating Scales of Impairment, Cognitive Assessment System, 2nd edition, and the Comprehensive Executive Functioning Inventory Adult, which is coming out this summer. And here is our relevant disclosure statement. Just wanted to make sure that everyone is aware, and all travel expenses and support for today's presentation are being covered by MHS. And before I hand it over to Dr. Goldstein, I just wanted to do a quick poll. Just wanted to get a sense of who is in the audience today. So you should be able to see the poll there. There we go. So please take a few seconds to respond to the poll. If your response doesn't fit into the top 3, then please type in the question pane the correct response for you. Okay, so let's take a look at who is in our audience. So it looks like more than half are school psychologists, but we'd like to welcome everyone to today's presentation. And now I am going to hand it over to Dr. Goldstein.
Thanks, Daniela. And it looks like one thing's for certain, everyone out there is alive. They all responded. And do I now have control of the slides? Yes, I do. First, let me say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and for some of you, good night. We have folks from over 30 countries all over the world with us today. I apologize that we have such a short amount of time to spend. I hope the time spent will be worthwhile for you. What I'd like to do today is change your mindset about what you do and why you do it, in particular the issue of assessment. And that is increasingly with more and more tests available to us, questionnaires, face-to-face instruments, self-report instruments. There is literally a gigantic, nearly unending list of assessments we could provide our clients. And I think our increasing mantra is the fewest tools to generate the most information in answering questions about why someone is or isn't doing what we need them to do, and most importantly, how to go about helping them. And as we discuss the issue of impairment today, I want to lay a little bit of foundation to start and then help you understand why I think it's important for you to shift your mindset to recognize that the appreciation and understanding of functional impairment, the functional problems people have in the world, is a critical component to your assessment, one that for most of us today we really have not been evaluating in any valid or reliable way. Let's go back in time for a moment. I always like to get people thinking about why we do what we do and whose idea it was. Sometimes we engage in behaviors as part of our assessments and never stop to think, well, why do we do that? Whose idea was that? Might there be a better way of doing it? So let's go back in time for a moment and pretend we are the first Congress on defining mental illness, because before that period of time, individuals with mental health or developmental problems were either segregated out of a community and left to live on their own, or placed in institutions that did little more than warehouse them. So we are the first group that will attempt to look at this issue compassionately. And in our meeting, we're going to try and decide how to define mental illness. How shall we look at these problems? And some of us suggest that we look at these problems by cause, trying to appreciate what causes the problem with the hope that by identifying the cause, we can thereby find the yellow brick road that will take us to the true solution. And the phrenologists among us tell us if we measure bumps on your head, maybe we can understand your cause. Others want to read our palms. Some of us want to look into our eyes. I know no one who's developed a theory of looking into people's ears to try and decide on their mental health problems. But we have this debate about cause, and we soon realize that we don't know enough to really categorize mental health problems by cause, and still to this day we attempt to do it. And genetics has afforded us a window into understanding cause from a biological perspective, but even highly genetic conditions like autism, we understand that there are multiple genes. Each gene probably contributes a small part of the variance, and for most diagnoses of childhood, including autism, environmental phenomena are as important in contributing to risk of a diagnosis as are biological. So we quickly discount the causative explanation and we move to the next. Emotions, behaviors, thoughts. Can we organize people's mental health problems by what they think, how they feel, or how they behave? And that's very popular for us because children, when we think about their problems, have two kinds of problems. When I meet a child for the first time, I do the bus test. I ask myself, if I was on a bus and had to sit next to this child, could I do it? And if so, for how long could I do it? And if we define children's problems that way, by the impact they have on us, we discover children have two kinds of problems, those that disturb and disrupt us, and those that worry us. I can sit on a bus next to a depressed, learning disabled child for a long period of time, but a restless, impulsive, or conduct impaired child will be much more challenging for me to sit next to. And we debate this issue of emotions, behaviors, and thoughts, and we think, well, we can group people that way, but even when we do, not everyone who appears unhappy or not everyone who behaves impulsively shares the same set of behaviors or symptoms. So we end up with a long list suggesting that people have to demonstrate some of the items on that list, but not all of them. And finally, the third discussion. Let's define people's challenges by the impairment they have in everyday life. Let's go to everyday life and ask, can this child sit in the classroom? Are they able to acquire knowledge? Can they go out on the playground and demonstrate appropriate social behavior? And when we do it that way, we quickly zero in on those that are impaired, their level of impairment, and the kinds of functional problems we have. Now, this is a hypothetical. 200 years ago, as far as I'm aware, this discussion didn't take place. But what happened 200 years ago was that there was a decision to organize and categorize mental health, behavioral, and emotional problems by that middle category, by emotions, behaviors, and thoughts. It led us to the ICD, for those of you that are around the world, or to the DSM, for those of you that are in North America. These are polythetic conditions, meaning they're like Chinese restaurant menus. You have to have a few symptoms from each column. The symptoms are not necessarily all equal, but they're assumed to be equal in the diagnostic process. And it's taken nearly 200 years for us to realize that emotions and behaviors and thoughts are a good place to start, but not a good place to finish. And if you truly want to understand how someone functions in everyday life, you have to go into everyday life and examine their behavior. And we're beginning to see a shift, not to negate asking about etiology or cause, not to negate the assessment of emotions and behaviors and thoughts, but to appreciate that our assessments thus far, absent an appreciation of functional limitation or functional impairment, really has not been complete. And that a thorough assessment, one that not only helps us understand the individual, but takes us to the threshold of designing interventions that will lead to functional improvement, that will lead to better quality of life for children, is just beginning. And today we're going to talk about this idea of impairment, and in particular, how one goes about measuring it. Now, if we shift our goals, and we have people on the line here from all over the world, and I have colleagues from all over the world. I edit the Journal of Attention Disorders, a comprehensive science journal, comes out 14 times a year, gives me the opportunity to interact with people on every continent in both large and some very small countries. It's given me the opportunity to understand that in each country or in each part of the world, there may be differences in how we evaluate in schools or in clinics, but there is a certain set of common themes that a comprehensive evaluation shares. We want to define symptoms. We want to have some understanding of behaviors that can be grouped together to tell us something about a diagnosis. In some circumstances, we want to gather data that helps us meet eligibility criteria. For those of you in North America, particularly in the United States, we use the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act. It is an eligibility act. It doesn't make diagnoses. It tells us if children's behavior, their development, their functioning meets certain eligibility criteria for them to receive special services at school. We also identify strengths and weaknesses in a comprehensive evaluation. And I've been particularly focused, those of you that know my work with Bob Brooks over the last 20 years, I and Bob and others have been increasingly focused on resilience. That is, when children transition into adult life, no one asks their worst subject or their most annoying behavior. People want to know what they can do. People want to know what they're capable of doing and how to help them be successful as they transition into adult life. So now we're increasingly measuring assets and not just weaknesses or liabilities, although we do have a liability-based model, both in diagnosis and in school placement. And finally, the goal of a comprehensive evaluation, I would argue, is to set a baseline, to know where we are as a means of understanding not just where we want to go, but also measuring the effectiveness of whatever we're doing in leading us to that place that we want to be, to that better place. So here's what I want to do today in the time we have. I've already introduced this idea of evaluation. I'm going to show you data that argues powerfully statistically, not just theoretically, but from a statistics perspective, from a science perspective, why in our questionnaires, in our face-to-face testing, in the history we gather, while we answer a lot of questions and provide data, we're missing a significant component of the behavior or the variables that contribute to everyday functioning. So I'll make a case for why to evaluate impairment by looking at what other instruments tell us about impairment. We'll talk a little bit about impairment from a conceptual perspective. We don't have a lot of time to do that. I'll try and define it for you and differentiate it from not just symptoms or behavior, but also from things like adaptive functioning. It's one of the common questions we're asked. How is impairment different from adaptive functioning? And in my conversations with the late Tom Oakland, whose work really set a foundation for what is adaptive functioning, I'll explain to you what Thomas thought and what we think. We'll talk about the data, and then I'll tell you a little bit about the rating scale of impairment, and I'll encourage you, as I do when new instruments come to the marketplace, to take advantage of opportunities to try them. When I have a new test, the first thing I do is try it on children whom I know to see if it's good at telling me what I already know about a child whom I've worked with for an extended period of time. When I obtain a new test, I try it out with some of the kids I know to get their feedback, to see what they think as consumers of the tests that we design for them. Again, why is it so important? Think about a FUBA, and that's a term we use in North America, a functional behavioral analysis. What we've come to realize is that if you want to know what someone's doing in the world, the best way to figure that out is to go watch them in the world. And those of you that are school psychologists or based in educational settings appreciate that you have limited time. And your observations, again in North America, your observations are mandated by law. You have to go in a classroom and watch a child at least once, and you have to have some way of comparing that child to the other kids in the classroom. Sometimes a child who's out of his seat frequently may not be that different from other kids in the class who are also out of their seat frequently. So you have to have some basis for an assessment. And given that there are increasing variables that affect children's behavior, one observation or two may not be enough. And hence, we've tried to apply the gold standard of behavioral observation to the assessment of impairment. And we are the first with this instrument to provide a valid and reliable, a thorough census-matched, multi-questionnaire overview of what is impairment. And as you'll see in the data, it answers questions other instruments don't answer. So what is the relationship between symptoms and functioning? And for a long time, we thought that the number of symptoms you had or the number of diagnoses you had tell us about how much impairment you have. We now know that that's not completely true, and that some children may have a broad range of symptoms and not have impairment. The example that I use when I talk to parents is that two people could be equally depressed. In their symptom report, one doesn't leave the house, and the other person gets up, goes to work, and we never know. So I'm not advocating that we don't evaluate symptoms. I'm not advocating that we don't assess behavior or other means of achievement or cognitive functioning. What I'm arguing for is that we need to add the assessment of functional impairment to our evaluation. That we are increasingly being asked to demonstrate the impact our diagnoses have in everyday life. We're increasingly being asked to evaluate impairment. Again, the IDEIA is the United States special education law. It serves about 14% of the U.S. Population, if I recall correctly, of children. The DSM-5 is the diagnostic manual of the American Psychiatric Association. The ICD, I think, now is in its 10th version. But again, all of them necessitate the assessment of impairment, and none of them give us a means to do it. And in fact, the DSM, up until 5, had the Global Assessment of Functioning, which was a way of at least getting in the ballpark about impairment. It is not in the DSM-5. The DSM now recommends that we use the standards set by the United Nations, the World Health Organization standards for impairment. Guess what? The rating scale of impairment is built theoretically. We started theoretically with the World Health Organization standards for impairment. So we started with what most nations of the world and consensus have agreed defines human impairment, and we built a statistical tool around it. And we're increasingly required to navigate assessment effectively. That is, 30 or 40 years ago, you could ask a series of questions, parents could say yes or no, and you could make a pronouncement about the child simply based on the number of yeses or the number of nos, really knowing nothing else about other children or about the community at large. And in the last 40 years, especially in the last 20 years, the standards have been increased. And the tools that we use to assess behavior or achievement or intellect increasingly have to be built in a scientific, in a valid and reliable way, have to be built not just on a rational factor analysis. A rational analysis means we put items together and prove they go together, but first and foremost built on an empirical analysis, meaning we gather the data and we demonstrate statistically that these items that we're measuring and collected data on actually tell us what we believe they tell us. And again, I think there's an increasing need to assess impairment. The DSM authors recognize that. For example, up through 1987, you could make a diagnosis of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder even if the individual reported to you, the parent or the individual themselves reported to you that they had no impairment in everyday life. So if you told me that you were hyperactive, you were inattentive, you were impulsive, I could make a diagnosis, and then I would ask, are you having any problems? And you could tell me no, and I would still give you the diagnosis. And there was an increasing appreciation among the authors of diagnostic protocols that this was a dangerous precedent, that all of us have some symptoms. And the real target for mental illness is not your symptoms and not the bumps on your head, but the functional impairments you have in everyday life. And the real target for our interventions in educational settings, in clinics, in the community, within households, the target isn't just the reduction of symptoms. It isn't just I'm feeling better or I'm sitting still, but am I more functional? And so if I'm treating your depression and you come back in and tell me that in the last month you've been feeling much less depressed and much happier, but you also tell me you're still not leaving the house, have we really made progress? So a little bit of background, and I may move through some of this quickly. My partner Jack Naglieri and I authored the first scientific textbook on impairment. Came out 8 years ago, and it was a very tiny volume because people simply weren't asking the question. We were very enmeshed in believing that once we counted symptoms and their severity, once we made diagnoses, then we could project based upon those symptoms and based upon those diagnoses how much trouble somebody would have in everyday life and why they were having trouble. And we've come to appreciate now that isn't necessarily true. We've got a new volume of our impairment textbook, which I believe will come out in a few months. The book is 4 times the size. And there is an increasing consensus about what is impairment, when in fact, when we started this work 10 years ago, the American Medical Association and the American Psychological Association and the American Psychiatric Association and the Association for People with Developmental Disorders, they all had very different definitions of what defined impairment. And so we are making an effort to come up with a unified theory, a unified definition. We still have a long way to go. I usually go to the authoritative source, Google or Wikipedia. You can do chronological Google searches to see how many hits you would have obtained at certain times in history. And clearly, as you can see from this slide, if you're able to see the number, more people, well, what have we got? We've got, is that 58 billion, right? No, 58 million. 58 million, so not quite as many people as Google, Madonna, or the Beatles, or Jesus, but people are asking about impairment, and we're seeing an increasing interest. So how do we sort through all this research? Again, as I've mentioned, the DSM concerned that people were receiving diagnoses without impairment heavily emphasizes the role of impairment in the DSM-4 and even more so in the DSM-5. That over 70% of diagnoses in the DSM require impairment, and in fact, the first question I now ask when I take a history from parents is not, why are you here, but tell me what kinds of functional problems your child has in the household, on the playground, in school. And I try and couch it not in symptom terminology, but in functional terminology. Don't tell me so much that your child doesn't sit still. Tell me what happens when he or she doesn't sit still at the dinner table. Or the other day, when I asked that of a parent, she said, well, I'll tell you what happens. He opened the seat belt and started to climb out of the car, and we were moving at 20 miles an hour. And he wasn't doing so because he was angry or upset. This is just a 5-year-old that is probably a descendant of Christopher Columbus or George Washington, and he was destined to stand up in the boat or jump out of the car to see where else he or she could go. The World Health Organization, again, as I pointed out, talks about functional impairment and this idea of classification of functioning. Now, traditionally, the WHO has focused on adults. In the last few years, they've increasingly been looking at children as well. This trend is consistent with how we've been in mental health throughout history. When depression was first conceptualized 100 years ago, the mental health professionals at the time professed that there was no need to evaluate for the possible depression in children, that children simply weren't developed enough in their frontal lobes to be depressed. We've seen this problem in children's experience of chronic pain. We've seen this historically, this sort of dichotomization that children, rather than being the early emerging organisms of what becomes lifetime functioning, are somehow these individuals who, when they turn of age, 16, 18, 21, somehow like a chrysalis, come out of a cocoon, and as adults, whoever they are, whatever they do, however they feel, has little to do with how they were as children. And now we very well understand that that's absolutely not true, and that while the child doesn't necessarily equate to the adult, there are changes that take place. Understanding and appreciating both strengths and weaknesses in children helps us help them transition more happily and successfully into everyday life. What does the research say? Well, when we ask about impairment in children, we find that parents will report impairment even though some of those children don't meet diagnostic criteria. We find that some children who do have diagnoses are not significantly impaired. I've been using our impairment instrument in our clinic. Ours is a university-affiliated clinic in Salt Lake City. We see about 400 children a year at our clinic. We've been giving RSIs now for almost a year, not quite. And I can tell you that as a tool, it adds something for me. Sure, it's my tool. You'll have to try it and see. But just this past week, on a questionnaire, the Connors that I use, a behavioral questionnaire, there were a number of elevated scales that clearly reflected this child was demonstrating behavioral and emotional symptoms that were in excess of other children. And yet the teacher's impairment rating was not significantly elevated. And in further exploring that, I came to appreciate that the kinds of behaviors the child was exhibiting was not particularly disruptive to others or to them completing schoolwork, interestingly enough. So while that may sound on first blush to be paradoxical, you'll see that there are children who have symptoms but not necessarily have impairment. And again, as I pointed out, the majority of DSM-5 diagnoses require impairment. And you can do it by asking, does the child have impairment? We've done that historically. We at one time asked, does the child have impairment? Now tell us on a Likert scale, if you're familiar with Likert scales, from 1 to 9. But now we're asking more questions. If you create a scale with one item, does the child have impairment in the classroom or on the playground? It's very difficult to get the kind of distribution that's needed in order to know the item is valid and reliable. All of the items in this questionnaire and in all the questionnaires Dr. Naglieri and I develop are distributed on a bell curve. they're not items that skew in one direction or another, meaning it's not the case that 90% of parents report their child doesn't exhibit the behavior at all, and 10% say very much, or vice versa, but that each item is distributed on a bell curve, which is, I think, very important in designing questionnaires. I think impairment is an outcome. I think impairment is a functional, observable manifestation that can be measured. It could be the outcome of a medical risk. I see children with genetic disorders, and their impairment could be the result of a sensory deficit, could be the result of a physical deficit, could be the result of a mindset problem. When I evaluate children, I look at their abilities, meaning can they plan or sequence or organize? What is their memory like? I look at their knowledge. What do they know? What have they learned? But I also look at how skillful they are in engaging in everyday life. How skillful are they in meeting the demands and expectations of the classroom or the household or the playground? And skill is an interesting phenomenon. It's a verb, not a noun. It's how skillful are you in functioning. And a child could have average ability and average knowledge, but be very skillful in school because they're diligent and patient and motivated. Another child might be very athletic and very well coordinated, but not compete well because they're anxious. So all kinds of things affect skill. And in another webinar at some point, I'll talk about how we integrate symptoms and behaviors with skill to really understand how a child functions in everyday life. In this case, we're looking at the outcome. What happens when you take ability and knowledge and skill and line them up and look at what happens in real life? What does it mean to be impaired? And here we come to understand how many variables affect what happens in everyday life. Because you may know what to do and not do what you know because you're unhappy, or because you can't see the blackboard, or because you're obsessing about something. So we look at all kinds of variables within the family and community, within the child, in an effort to understand how does this child functionally behave in a given setting. Variables within the family. We know that parental variables are powerful in shaping how parents describe their children. One of the things we do with our instruments is try and build in validity measures. Some measures that allow us to draw conclusions as to whether a parent is over or under-reporting, whether they're actually reading the items, whether they're responding consistently. We know that variables within a community, within the broader culture, may play a role in how impaired someone may be. If we expect a 5-year-old to do things an 8-year-old can do, as a community, we're going to find that we have a lot more children with impairment. We also know that, again, some symptoms are more potent in predicting impairment, that not all symptoms are created equal. So, for example, if you were applying for a job to help me as a writer in my work, and you had great references and very good work samples, but 2 spelling errors in your resume, those two spelling errors in an algorithmic model might count more towards whether I hire you than all the other data you bring to me. And we're increasingly recognizing the importance of an algorithm in terms of weighting symptoms. And even in the DSM, we're beginning to do it. The diagnosis of depression requires that you have one of the first 2 symptoms and then 4 of the remaining 7. So you must have one of the first 2. And I think we're going to see more and more the use of an algorithm in understanding symptoms and their contribution to diagnoses. And I'll also tell you that in an algorithmic model, for example, the symptoms of ADHD, as described by the teacher, have different weightings than is described by the parent. And we know that about ADHD. We don't know that about other disorders like autism, but we will learn about it. So this idea that symptoms are these rigidly measured phenomena, regardless of the reporter, is changing. And that we understand that symptoms are interpreted through the eye, of the reporter, and that should be reflected in an algorithm. Further, age makes a difference. I can tell you that in many instruments, you see age effects. For example, in instruments that measure behavior, you clearly see an age effect, and that at some ages, certain kinds of behaviors that might be more normal at a younger age are considered more impaired at an older age, or vice versa. We also know that gender can play a role. We may see a difference in how gender affects impairment. And we also understand that impairment is not easily understood on a linear continuum, meaning what is impaired at one age may not be impaired at another age. We don't expect 5-year-olds to behave like 10-year-olds. But one of the things we find is that if we do aged match comparisons, impairment is a consistently measured variable throughout childhood. That is, older kids are not necessarily less impaired than younger kids when they're compared to their age. We also know, again, that the relationship of a particular condition to levels of impairment is not always evenly distributed across a bell curve. We know that socioeconomic and minority status affects how people view impairment. I've taken histories from parents who do not view their children as particularly impaired, when through my eyes they are, and the teacher's eyes they are, but the entire family shares an equal level of impairment, and so the entire family shares an equal level of impairment, and so they don't see the child as having a challenge. Nobody can find their left shoe when it's time to leave, and that's not necessarily seen as a problem for this child. And again, certain conditions may cause more or less impairment in certain settings. So I hope I haven't confused you with too much verbiage, but I think impairment is the reduced ability to meet the demands of life because of a particular physical or psychological or cognitive condition. Now, let's just take a slight side trip here and quickly, I don't want to run out of time, but quickly ask questions about impairment versus things like symptoms. So inattention is a symptom. The consequence of that symptom may be you don't finish your homework. That's the impairment. And when I take a history, I sometimes divide a paper in half and draw a line down a paper, and as I listen to parents tell me about their children or teachers tell me about their students, I will jot down their comments either on the symptom side or the impairment side. It's important to distinguish between the two. There are a finite set of symptoms. There are an infinite set of impairments or collection of impairments that symptoms might cause. A child can be inattentive and not necessarily have impairment in all areas. And all of you who evaluate children know that parents will always tell you in response to your question, is there something the child pays attention to? They always nominate things that the child enjoys, are not necessarily boring or repetitive or effortful, things that have an immediate predictable payoff. For some children, they pay attention to, even though they are described by everyone else as inattentive. So I think there's a very clear difference between symptoms and impairment. I think there's a difference between impairment and severity. Severity is a measure of how much, and on the RSI, it's on a scale from not at all to very much. So you can measure severity in a lot of different ways, both statistically and descriptively. And situation. Again, impairment is different because impairment is how much functional trouble you have. The situation tells us where you have that trouble. And in our work with children, we've been particularly sensitive to trying to understand the impact of situation on generalization. 30 years ago, as we began teaching children to problem solve, we thought if we taught them in our exam rooms and role-played it, that our work was done. And we now understand that in order for it to really take, you have to go out into the playground, out into the classroom, and reinforce generalization. So situation plays a role, but situation is where the impairment is demonstrated. Now, the $64 question. How does impairment differ from adaptive behavior? And I'll make my case Some of you may agree, some of you may disagree. I'm more than happy to engage in an email exchange with any of you if you have a different view of it. But I think adaptive behavior is reflective of knowledge. I think the question about adaptive behavior that's being asked is, does the child know how to do something? And then the late Tom Oakland and I agreed on that. And even his adaptive behavior instrument, which is a large tool typically used for children with significant developmental delays, asks you to first determine whether the child possesses the behavior and then offer some opinion as to how well they exhibit the behavior. And the latter would be impairment. But again, the ABOS in its third edition now is a very good tool, but it's a large tool, one that I think precludes its use in everyday clinical practice for children who don't have significant developmental impairments. So adaptive behavior, do you know how to use the tool? Impairment, not using the tool. Again, do you know how to do it? Skill, as opposed to performance. Do you actually do it? And if you go back and take a look at Tom's writing, or you take a look on my website, which is just samgoldstein.com, there are PDFs of my talks. There are a number of expanded RSI talks where I have quotes from some of Tom's work looking at this issue of what is adaptive behavior. But again, I think adaptive behavior is, do you know? Impairment is, do you actually do it? And the larger the gap between those two, the more impairment someone might have. And finally, what is a disorder? And then what is a disability? And I think those terms are bandied around. What is a disorder? And how disordered do you have to be considered having a disorder? All of us sometimes are a little blue or unhappy. All of us are sometimes a little inattentive or impulsive. Do we have a disorder? Often disorder is defined not just by possessing the symptoms, but the chronicity, the chronology, and the impact those symptoms have. How much functional trouble do you have? For me, a disorder is more a political phenomena. Could it be a disease? It's a deviation from the normal. It's a collection of objective signs. Do we understand why certain symptoms cluster together? Sometimes we do, as in restless symptoms. They all relate to how well you can keep your body in one place. Sometimes we don't. We still don't have a good appreciation for why symptoms of restlessness and hyperactivity, for example, are so entwined with symptoms of impulsivity. Try as we might to create two separate empirically derived scales, one for impulsivity, one for hyperactivity. We've been unable to do it. And on face validity, it would seem that the two might be predictive of each other, but to be so entwined, it's been a challenge for us to understand. So ADHD really is a two-factor disorder, symptoms of inattention and symptoms of hyperactivity, impulsivity. Again, our impairment rating and our question about impairment is not asking about the why. It's not asking, do you have a disorder? Do you have a certain condition? It's simply asking, do you have impairment? If you want to know why the person has impairment, then you have to do the first part of the assessment we just talked about a few minutes ago. And if you want to know what to do to reduce impairment, you have to do the first part of the assessment. But it does give you, I think, an exceptionally good baseline of functional limitation. And finally, what is a disability? That's a whole other issue. It tends to be more of a cultural or a political issue. Typically, people with disabilities don't like to be considered having a disability and often argue against their being considered as a disabled person. If we look at the North American, the U.S. special education law, you'll notice that the IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, it defines a group of disabilities. It doesn't match all disabilities recognized in the community under the Americans with Disabilities Act. It's a selective group. But as you read what's on that slide, you'll notice a lack of consensus. An intellectual disability, followed by a hearing impairment, followed by a number of other impairments, followed by a disturbance, followed by autism, for which there's no qualifier, traumatic brain injury, specific learning disability. So the drafters of this legislation, while they had advisors who were educational and mental health experts, themselves were legislators. And what you see when you examine this listing, you realize that terms are being bandied around without clear definition. Is an impairment the equivalent of a disability? Is a disturbance the equivalent of an impairment? This is a problem in this language, but all of these categories are used to determine eligibility. And assessing impairment in the eligibility process, again, the DSM, prior to the DSM-5, used the Global Assessment of Functioning, for which there's some data to show it did get you in the ballpark. The new DSM doesn't have one, tells us to use the World Health Organization standards. The HUDAS, which has been normed. There are some international norms for adults, but no standards for children as we sit here today. And then the IDEA, which was revised as the IDEIA. In the United States, each state interprets that a little bit differently. Some states use the word impairment in their language, others do not. But the bottom line, as any school psychologist, not just in the US, but in Canada and perhaps other parts of the world, can tell you, is that if they don't demonstrate impairment, and in fact, the IDEIA specifically has a paragraph that states it's not enough to meet the symptom count or the testing thresholds for the conditions we just looked at. You have to demonstrate that they cause sufficient limitation. Again, terminology has been the bane of our debate because similar words are used to describe different concepts, and sometimes very different words are used to describe similar concepts. But I would argue that simply having a behavioral condition or scoring low on a test doesn't qualify you under IDEIA as being eligible for service if you don't have a functional impairment. And now for the RSI, just briefly. And I want to show you some data for those of you that perhaps are getting a little restless or perhaps have other things to do or are getting ready to go back to sleep for a few hours. Stay on for a few minutes because I want to show you the data, because the data argues powerfully that what's being measured by the RSI is not measured through the traditional behavioral scales and assessment tools that you've been using. My buddy Jack, who's not with us today, Jack and I began developing tests together a number of years ago, and at least the impetus for me was that the tests we were using to make important decisions about children's lives, whether they should receive certain treatments, whether they should receive certain medications or placements in school, the instruments that were being used, from my view, were neither valid nor reliable. And that we have a responsibility for using instruments that allow us to support foundationally the conclusions that we are drawing about children and the recommendations that we are making about children. And the value of a diagnosis or an eligibility determination is not just threshold, not just to give you permission to receive a service or a medication, but rather to help us decide how to best help you and to help us mitigate risk over time. By putting you in an eligibility group, by comparing you to a diagnostic group, it allows us to gaze through your eyes, compare you to other youth with your condition who perhaps have grown up. And in knowing what helped them, in knowing what harmed them, we're in a better position to help the child in front of us. This is the real value of a diagnosis, and this is the real value of trying to gather data that tells us about impairment. Take a look at this slide. You may have to move close to the screen to see this, and I'm going to work from bottom up. What this slide tells us is the relationship between the RSI, and let me lay a little foundation. The RSI is a tool that's used or can be used in conjunction with any broad spectrum tool. It is not a narrow spectrum tool. Narrow spectrum tools measure one condition, such as anxiety or depression or autism. Broad spectrum tools measure a variety of conditions, each in a brief way. The Child Behavior Checklist, the BASC, the Conners. These are broad spectrum tools, and I always advocate you start with a broad spectrum tool, take a history, do an observation, and then determine what narrow spectrum tools are needed to give you more data about a particular condition like depression or anxiety or autism or even ADHD. The RSI is neither of the two. The RSI is a measure of functional impairment, and therefore we recommend it be used in every assessment along with a broad spectrum tool. Now, I'll show you why I say we should use it in every assessment. So the RSI, as I mentioned, started in its conceptualization through the theory of the World Health Organization standards for impairment. What we demonstrated statistically in an exploratory factor analysis that the World Health Organization standards actually worked. They worked statistically. That when we created items to measure each of the scales and then collected a census-matched normative sample, thousands of children as looked at by parents and teachers, what we demonstrated was that the categories of 6 at home, 5 or 6 at home, and I'll show you those, and 3 at school were valid and reliable in an exploratory factor analysis, that we were really measuring 6 different phenomena at home and 3 different phenomena at school. And it's our belief, and we believe very strongly, that all behavioral instruments should begin with an exploratory factor analysis to demonstrate what you're really measuring. And then you can create rational scales and statistically demonstrate that these scales have items that go together and can be then used to plan for treatment. The RSI will tell you how impaired a child is, but the RSI will not tell you what to do about it. The RSI is an outcome measure. The RSI is a very good way of telling you whether the interventions that you have implemented are working. And we designed the RSI to be used every 4 weeks, unlike a lot of tools that require 12 weeks or even 6-month intervals. The RSI can be used in a valid and reliable way month by month to measure change. Now, let's come back to what this slide says. So this slide looks at the relationship between the RSI and other measures. This slide tells us the extent to which the RSI and other measures are measuring the same phenomena. And the closer they are, the higher the number. The lower they are, the more it tells you that each of them is measuring something different. Don't worry about the minus signs, but if you remember how to look at correlation, you multiply that correlation by itself, and it tells you how much the two tests overlap, how much they're measuring the same thing. Well, look at the ability and achievement measures. The Wechsler, the Woodcock Achievement, and the Cognitive Assessment System, which is a test that J.P. Doss and Jack Naglieri developed, and I'm one of the authors on the second edition. And when you multiply numbers like 0.05 by itself, what you realize is you're obtaining less than 1%, if I'm looking at my numbers correctly. And what it tells you is that the IQ and the achievement and the neuropsych measure, which is the CAS, doesn't really tell you a whole lot about how much functional impairment is out in the world as measured by the RSI. Now let's work backwards. Let's look at psychopathology. Some of you may not like that term, but let's look at the Conners, the behavioral Conners, the content scales, and the symptom scales. And I like the Conners. It's a wonderful broad spectrum tool. But if you multiply 0.25 times 0.25, then you realize that maybe 5% of the variance in what the RSI is measuring is measured by these other tools. So just giving a Conners probably doesn't tell you a lot about impairment. It tells you about symptoms, it tells you about content, different sets of behaviors. It gives you good data to plan as a baseline for intervention, but it doesn't tell you enough about impairment. Let's look at executive function. Actually, let's jump here. Let's look at adaptive behavior. So this is Tom Oakland's instrument. Multiply 0.5 times 0.5, and it tells you that about 25% of the variance overlaps between what the adaptive behavior, the ABOS measures, and the RSI. So the majority of what the ABOS is telling you, I believe, is more about do you know what to do, and what the RSI is telling you is do you do what you know. Let's look at social emotional competency, the Devereux. This is Jack Naglieri's tool, and you've got a 0.71. That's almost 50% of the variance. Is that surprising? No, because the Devereux asks about strategy. The Devereux asks questions about how the child copes in everyday life, and skill. How skillful you are is contributed to by the kinds of behaviors the Devereux measures, but it's still the case that half of what the RSI tells you about functional impairment doesn't measure on the Devereux. And one last one, executive functioning. And that's our comprehensive executive functioning instrument, our CEFI. It asks questions about 9 kinds of behaviors: emotional regulation, for example, planning, attention, initiation, organization. We know that those kinds of behaviors are powerfully predictive in telling us how functionally people operate in everyday life. So is it surprising that 50% of the variance is predicted by the CEFI? No. But it's still the case that the majority of the variance, when you look at all of these instruments, it's still the case that the majority of what the RSI tells you is not told to you by tests, by behavioral questionnaires, by symptom measures. If you want to know about impairment, you have to ask about impairment. There are 2 other measures that do ask about impairment. Dr. Barkley's tool, and you'll notice the overlap is fairly high. The difference between our 2 tools, I think, is part of function of the way we ask questions and the number of questions we ask versus Dr. Barkley. And finally, the Children's Global Assessment Scale, which is a symptom scale, and the overlap there is, again, not great. So what this data tells us is if you want to measure impairment, you need something else besides what has been available to do it. And what it also tells us is if you buy into the fact that what people do in everyday life is the best indicator of how they're doing, you need some measure. And if you can't follow them around all day, I joke with parents when they come to see me that the best way of evaluating their children would be to follow the child around for 2 weeks. And parents, of course, then offer me their child. I've had parents who also offered me large sums of money to take their child home for the weekend so I could see what actually takes place, because at least in my exam room, kids typically have a good time, and some kids have a hard time, but it's the case that most kids are on their best behavior when they come see me. And so what I see in my exam room is not always typical of what parents and teachers see out in the world. Key features of the RSI, it's brief. When we first started creating questionnaires, and I was there at the beginning with Dr. Connors, we had a 10-item scale, called it the Iowa Connors, and slowly we kept adding more and more items. Our belief was the more questions we asked, the more data we collected, the better assessment we would do, until parents and teachers rebelled and refused to complete questionnaires containing literally thousands of questions. We're now moving in the other direction. The science of statistics now enables us to create scales that are as brief as possible, but provide as much valuable information as is possible to glean from the instrument. And that's how we created the RSI, which is why it's only 29 items for the teacher, measures 3 scales. Because we found that more items didn't give us any better measure, and fewer items cost us an understanding in terms of differentiating one child from another. The items are age appropriate. It's designed for 5 to 18 years. We have a normative sample, just so you understand. It's not a virginal sample. A virginal sample would be to take children who are pure and have had no problems. We're not interested in that. We're interested in children who are out in the world. That the child you're looking at is handicapped relative to the children around them. And the children around them is the general population. So all of the tests Dr. Naglieri and I developed start out with norm reference samples, a normative sample that contains a representative percentage of children with different disorders or different diagnoses. The instrument is designed to be used regardless of etiology or problem. The instrument can be used with children who have medical problems, with children with developmental or behavioral or educational problems, because the instrument is designed to tell you about what the child does functionally in everyday life. Not to measure every single behavior, but to give us a valid and reliable understanding of that. It is available in Spanish, and we have it translated, and I believe we have some small studies done to demonstrate that it is valid and reliable, that an understanding isn't lost in the Spanish language. Because it can be reassessed every 4 weeks, you can monitor progress over time. It does satisfy impairment criteria for DSM. We believe it also satisfies criteria in impairment based on the World Health Organization and based on special education law. We think it's valuable in setting baselines for intervention and for treatment planning. We think it can be used on an individual or group basis. It can be used in research. We think it has broad applicability. This is a very brief overview of the instrument. We broke it out by items, younger and older. There's a parent and teacher form for each. There's 41 items for the parent for the younger children, 49 for the older, because there's an additional scale for parents, self-care. 29 items for the teacher at both ages, because teachers are measuring just 3 areas of impairment. You might ask, where is the self-report? And we did attempt to have a self-report, and I have to tell you in all honesty that while teenagers will self-report about their executive functioning or even other symptomatology, when it comes to the question of are you impaired, most teenagers are legends in their own mind. And what we found was that teenagers' responses to the impairment scale were fairly flat, regardless of whether they were seen as having impairment in the eyes of their parents or teachers. So for the moment, we do not have a self-report. It's an interesting phenomenon. The RSI is built on a 6-point Likert scale. I can tell you we try a 4, we try 6, we try 8, and then look for the scale that gives us the best distribution for each item. We never pick an odd number of items, because then people tend to gravitate towards the middle. And the scales, as you can see, for the teacher, school and work, social and mobility. For the parent of the younger child, those 3, plus domestic or household activities, family activities, and for the teenager, the parents are also asked to measure self-care. The reports are easy to interpret. Nowadays, most of these instruments are completed in the cloud, so you send a link to the parent or teacher, they complete it. When that happens, you receive a link, and that link then lets you download the report. And this is the 4th instrument we've designed, and each time we work with users in an effort to create reports that are user-friendly. We have a parent report. We have a comparative report that allows you to compare currently, meaning 2 parents or 3 teachers, but it also allows you to compare over time, meaning what did a parent report last month, what are they reporting this month. I can tell you that we're sticklers about collecting data. It is census matched. You typically collect usually 3 times as many data points, meaning 3 times as much data as you end up using for your sample. We don't necessarily pick the cases we like. Rather, you end up with more or fewer, for example, cases in particular areas when we try and match to the census. I can tell you that when we match to the census, we don't just match to each census variable alone, meaning part of the country or a gender or ethnicity. We try and match in each part of the country all of those variables. So in a southern part of the United States, we want parents that run across the educational level, run across the socioeconomic level, if that makes sense. So we really have a match to the census. The RSI, like all of our tools, and I'm proud of that, has good psychometric properties if you understand validity and reliability. Validity tells you, are you measuring what you say you're measuring? For example, the high correlations between the ABOS, between the CEFI, the Devereux, even the Barkley rating scale tells us that we're in the ballpark, that we are measuring what we think we're measuring in regards to functional limitation. Reliability tells you, if you measured it multiple times, whether what you're measuring you're actually getting. And so if you look at the left target, you can have an instrument that is neither reliable or valid. If you look at the middle, it's reliable. You're always getting a measure in the same place, but it's not valid. It isn't measuring what you say you're measuring. It's got good internal consistency, meaning the items really go together. They load together. It's got good stability over time. It's got good content validity. When you have time after the presentation, you can take a look at the description. And again, I would encourage you to take advantage of MHS's generosity and test a few cases and see how it works for you. I mean, if it doesn't work for you, then you'll know very quickly. You don't even have to purchase the tool. But I'll tell you, be careful, because our tools, not just the RSI, but all of our tools work. And so once you use the tool, it's seductive. And if you're not prepared to buy the tool, maybe you shouldn't try the tool, because my suspicion is you'll use the tool and say, oh, okay, now I have to use it on all of my cases. And you'll see the difference there as you begin looking at items between, what is domestic versus what is family, what is self-care. Interestingly enough, when we were looking at items, one of the items on self-care was toothbrushing, and it didn't load with other hygiene items. It tended to load more with behavior. And it would appear that toothbrushing is more about doing what parents say than really about hygiene. It's the number, turns out it's the number one hygiene issue that parents and children debate about and have differences about. So it's become more about compliance than anything else. It's got good criterion-related validity. These graphs may be a little challenging for you to look at. You can take a look at them later. Each of those graphs, each of those plots is looking at a different diagnosis. And you can see the mobility one is one that most children, regardless of diagnosis, are not rated low on. As you look at it, again, it helps you appreciate that the RSI tells you about impairment, but it doesn't tell you necessarily a whole lot about the reasons for that impairment. And interestingly, this is in the clinical group, this is the parent form, and you can see some differences there. It's an interesting, the ADHD group are particularly interesting in that on this sample that we looked at least from parents' reports, there weren't a lot of complaints about school at home. Here's teacher reports. No, the ADHD group is highly elevated. That's the red group. I knew there was a problem there. That yellow one down below are kids with physical impairments. And as you can see, most kids with mobility impairments don't necessarily have school-based or school performance problems. And that's true here too. Now this is by diagnosis, so the theory would be more diagnoses, more impairment. And as you can see, as you add more diagnoses, impairment ratings go up. You can also see that in this sample, some kids had multiple diagnoses but didn't cross a 1 standard deviation threshold for complaints about impairment. And this is on a teacher form. This is on the older parent form. And it would appear that the magic number is 4. That having 1 to 3 diagnoses it takes you away from the general population a bit, but once you have 4, then you're really different. And nowadays we've taken to giving kids multiple diagnoses. Initially, when I started in my practice, I'm so old that we had 2 diagnoses, and they were based on how the child affected me. And I did the bus test, meaning I asked myself when I met this child, if I was sitting on a bus next to him or her, could I do it? And on the bus, kids had two kinds of problems. They disturbed me or they worried me. And I had trouble sitting on a bus next to an impulsive, oppositional conduct impaired child, but I could sit on a bus next to a reading disabled, anxious child for a long period of time. And this is John Weary. I'm not sure if John's still alive, the New Zealander. This is John Weary's original work, that children have two kinds of problems based on the impact to adults, and the two kinds of problems are how they affect us. They either worry us or they disturb us. And we have now attempted to break that out, to look at mild disruption as ADHD and moderate as oppositional defiance and more significant as conduct disorder. We've tried to separate out symptoms of depression from symptoms of anxiety. But as we do it, all of you need to understand, we increasingly specialize in these diagnoses, try and make them more discrete. But when you look at their overlap, when you look at the overlap in an epidemiologic population-based sample, the overlap, for example, of say, anxiety and depressive symptoms, you find that kids who are unhappy and depressed are anxious and worried, and kids who are anxious and worried are often unhappy and depressed. And so the best way of starting out, if I was you, when I take a history, first thing I ask myself is, if I'm on a bus, how disruptive is this child? How internalizing? It's the Achenbach model of internalizing, externalizing. And the children that are most difficult to work with are those that exhibit both disruptive and non-disruptive problems. Because when you attempt to set limits, they fall apart emotionally. And when you attempt to be supportive emotionally, they run over you with their behavior. And you've all experienced kids like this. And so when I look at a child who's got impairment and I'm working my way back, I'm asking how much of the impairment might be from disruptive versus non-disruptive behavioral challenges. So let me offer some conclusions here in this whirlwind presentation. And then I think we can take some questions, and then Daniela will talk to you about obtaining your certificate or further follow-up. And I appreciate all of you throughout the world taking your time away from either work or leisure, or for some of you, sleep, and joining us. I hope it was worth your time. I hope you've taken away one or two things that'll make you think a little bit differently about what you do as an evaluator. And if tomorrow or next week you're taking a history or completing an evaluation and you find yourself asking, how impaired is this child? Then I'll know that perhaps I've had some influence on your mindset. Impairment can be defined. It can be measured. Functional impairment can be accurately measured. There are probably other tools that do it. I mentioned two of them. It's our opinion that ours at this moment is the best developed, the most valid, the most reliable tool for assessing impairment. As I mentioned, it is neither a broad spectrum nor a narrow spectrum tool. It is a tool that's meant to be used hand in hand with a broad spectrum tool to let you appreciate and understand how much impairment a child may have in a particular setting, in this case, school and home. And you can't answer that question with an IQ test, with an achievement test, with a measure of symptoms or behaviors. You can get in the ballpark with a measure of adaptive functioning. You can get in the ballpark with a measure of executive functioning. But if you want to hit a home run, you need some measure of impairment. And again, we think it's the most valid, reliable, and comprehensive measure. But of course, I'm going to tell you that because it's my tool. But those of you that know me know, and know Jack, that the tools we bring to the market take many, many years and many, many people at MHS to analyze and work with. And the things we bring to the market, we're very confident, are functional and useful. And I think assessment of and monitoring of impairment offers a very important advance for us. And I think we're going to see an increasing push and an increasing ask from school personnel, from funders, mental health funders, from disability evaluators, whether it's Social Security or health disability. We're going to see an increasing ask about impairment. And we need to be prepared for both children and in adults to be able to answer the question, not just in an observational way, but in a valid and reliable and statistical way. So thank you all, and I'll turn it over to Daniela now to field some questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Goldstein. So we've had a lot of great questions coming in. As I mentioned earlier, we most likely won't get to all of these questions, but please know that we will respond to them afterwards and send out the responses to everyone. So the first one that I have here is, can impairment be considered the same concept as adverse educational impact with regards to eligibility for special education?
And I won't repeat the question because I'm assuming everyone can hear you reading the question. They don't see it.
Yeah.
And again, I think that speaks to what I mentioned earlier, that every state has chosen different nomenclature, but my simple answer would be absolutely yes.
Okay, great. If impairment is identified in early childhood, how often should a child be reevaluated to assess if a child is reaching developmental milestones in the impairment, in particular in the context of qualifying for services?
And if this is a question from someone in North America or even Canada, you have to requalify every 3 years. So the tool could be used every 3 years as part of a comprehensive eligibility assessment. We're also advocating that the tool be used, and I didn't have time to do a case example, but we're advocating that the tool be used on an ongoing basis to measure response to treatment over time. And because the tool can be used every 4 weeks, assuming you have an unlimited budget, you can give it 3 or 4 or 5 times during a school year. You can give it as many times as you want. There is, as far as we are aware, there's no significant regression to the mean, meaning the more times you give it, it isn't the likelihood that the child will be scored better and better, even if they're not really better.
Okay, and so sort of related, another question was, is the RSI sensitive and reflective of even small changes?
Yes. So in the manual and also in the computerized analysis, when we're doing pre-post comparisons, we determine statistically how big a change is necessary in order for you to conclude that there's been a statistically significant change in the child's score. And it's not the same for every scale, and it's not the same at every age, and it's not the same for every reporter, parent versus teacher.
Okay, and again, continuing on. So if a youth demonstrates impairment on certain scales and then an intervention is introduced, and I want to determine if that made a difference, should I re-administer only the scales where the impairments were originally flagged, or re-administer the entire assessment?
Well, that's really up to you. It's 29 items from the teacher and 40 or so items for the parent. And so it's not very many items. I'd probably give the whole thing. You're paying for the whole thing.
And I think you said
I just give the whole thing, and it only takes a few minutes for a parent to fill out. I don't think it's even 10 minutes.
Okay.
And for a teacher, I mean, it's under 5 minutes because it's only 29 items for the teacher and
So you
40
might as
some
well.
odd. Right.
Yeah. Okay. Different question. So many of the families that I work with, the parents are illiterate. Can I read them the parent form? Will that work?
Yes, you can read it to them.
Okay.
And you'll have to give them anchor points so they understand the Likert scale. You have to understand that when we collected the normative data, we didn't collect a sample in which it was read to parents.
Right.
But I think reading it to them would not invalidate the use of the norms for analysis. Assuming they understood, again, they have to understand the question.
Yes.
And they have to understand the Likert scale, what their choices are. And I would create a little Likert scale for them in front of them, and make sure they understood what each of the points was describing, and have them just point to which of the 7 descriptors they want to respond to.
Okay, great idea. You mentioned the Spanish version. Is the Spanish RSI normed on Spanish speakers? Are there separate norms available? How does that work?
For the moment, I do not believe there are separate norms available. We've done pilot studies with our other tools and demonstrated that the North American norms are valid and reliable to use with Spanish speakers, particularly in Puerto Rico. We've done that. But no, there are not separate norms.
Okay. And is it only online, or are there paper forms available?
There are paper forms available. The paper form can be completed by a parent and can be hand scored, or the paper form can be completed by either a parent or teacher for both. And then you can use a jump drive to score it and enter the data in, and you receive the same kind of report as if it's been completed online. I would encourage that. You just don't obtain the same value in terms of the statistical analysis when you're hand scoring it.
Okay. Different question. I am a school psychologist and I don't really do any diagnostic work. I focus a lot more on intervention and accommodation. So how would the RSI be useful to me?
For you, the RSI would be a good tool to use for treatment monitoring, to see if your accommodations are effective in reducing impairment.
Okay.
So it's a good tool. You don't need to give a broad spectrum or a narrow spectrum behavioral tool to see the effectiveness of your in-classroom accommodations, and just have the teacher fill it out after 4 weeks to see what the teacher's response is.
If the measure is multidimensional, why is there a total score? What value does that have?
Very good question. So on our other instruments, all the items are lumped together and we create total score. On this instrument, because we didn't want to overemphasize one scale over another, the total score really is kind of sort of a mean of the other cluster scores. As an individual score, it could be used if a broad measure was needed to qualify a child, for example, for Social Security, where you have to be impaired in more than one domain overall. Keep in mind, however, that the way we computed the total score, if one scale is significantly elevated, it will have an inordinately larger impact on that total score than the other two scales. So you have to keep that in mind. In our analysis, which we haven't gone through today because we haven't done a case example, we emphasize evaluating each of the individual scales first and then the combined scale, whereas in our other tools, we advocate for looking at the combined, the factor scores first, and then, looking at the total score, the factor scores, and then the treatment scales. Here we're saying start with the individual scales.
Okay. Question about why is there no self-report version? So there's parent and teacher, but no self.
And I think I mentioned that a couple of minutes ago. We tried, but in this instrument, for whatever reason, teenagers don't seem to appreciate their level of impairment as it's viewed through the eyes of parents and teachers, which is interesting because on our executive function measure, they were absolutely accurate in seeing their problems. And so it may be in the nature of the questions. It's unclear. It's a good dissertation topic if someone's interested. It's a good topic for dissertation.
Okay, and I think we have time for one last question. So can the tool be used for a primary care physician to help identify children with needs for further assessment by a different professional?
Great question. I come from a medical school, and I've done quite a few talks for physicians on making exam room decisions. Pediatricians and family practitioners often have a very short period of time. Mom and dad come in for a well check, and mother says, "Oh, by the way, he doesn't sit still. He doesn't." And typically they'll start sometimes with a narrow spectrum instrument, a Vanderbilt or something they give away. This is a good tool to just ask about impairment, and in a short duration, a nurse can be trained to give it and score it. And the physician can come back even in the same visit and say, look, your answers suggest your child is really having impairment in school. Let's get more information from school.
Excellent. Okay, thank you so much. So as I mentioned, that's all the time we had for questions, but please know that we will respond to all of the questions after today's webinar and send them out to everyone. Just a few more things that I'd like to cover off. So there are a number of MHS representatives here to support you. Over the next 2 slides, you'll find the maps and contact information of all the education and clinical MHS representatives. Depending on where you're located, please feel free to contact your specific rep. This slide displays your MHS education assessment consultants based on the location in the US and Canada. And also in your handout, you'll see this on the last couple of slides, so you don't have to memorize this right now. And this is the contact information for your clinical representatives for both US and Canada. As well, you'll see that the international MHS representative is listed at the bottom of the slide with her contact information. Please, again, feel free to reach out to your specific rep if you have any questions regarding the RSI or any other MHS assessments, including requesting additional information, meeting, presentation, pricing, ordering, pretty much anything you want to ask. They are happy to help and really open to any questions you have. Just want to mention that we also offer some self-paced options to gain CE or CPD credits. So this is just a snapshot of what we offer through our Learn Center, mhs.com/learn. So I encourage you to take a look at that. As I mentioned earlier, we are recording this program today, so for anyone who wasn't able to watch it live and participate in our live version, they will have the opportunity to watch the recorded version in our Learn Center and also obtain some CE credits that way. And lastly, I just want to thank Dr. Goldstein once again for taking the time away from his busy schedule, and all of you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to participate with us today on the webinar. I hope that you found some value in what you heard. And again, any questions you have, please reach out to any of us here at MHS. Have a great rest of your day, and thank you everyone for your attendance.